brilliant essay by Senior Fellow at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Karim Sadjadpour, who has written in this month's Foreign Affairs, October Foreign Affairs, on the pathways that the Islamic regime can take once and if it falls, or the future of Iran. And he has enumerated 5 different scenarios, which we will touch upon today. It's a short discussion because we have 20 minutes for Q&A. So excuse me if I have a one-liner as the panelists insisted on their introduction. I had a whole panoply of information to give you, but they're so brilliant, they're so well-loved, they're so well-respected. I think you know their reputation already. So Robin Wright is, I'm not even gonna say what year, but for a long time has been a columnist and a writer for The New Yorker. Karim Sadjadpour is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Professor Ali Ansari is the founding director of the Center for Iranian Studies at the University of St. Andrews. I know you want to hear from our panelists, but I have to set up the conversation. And for me to do that, I have to read a small paragraph from Karim's essay so that we can continue. So he wrote, putting up for us to know and feel what Iran is facing right now. Iran's 92 million people make up the largest population in the world, isolated from the global financial and political system. Iran's economy is among the world's most sanctioned. Its currency is among the world's most devalued. Its passport is among the world's most denied. Its internet is among the world's most censored. Its air is among the world's most polluted. Tehran does not control the skies. Khamenei's closest advisors are dead, and its nuclear program for now is buried under rubble. To top it all, Khamenei is cancer-stricken and 86 years old. So Karim, you kind of read this and you say, oh my God, how is Iran withstanding all these pressures? But then immediately in your second paragraph, you talk about Iran's biggest weakness, which is lack of trust. Could you elaborate on that so I can take the conversation, I can go backwards a little bit, talk about the Iranian political culture, so I can move the conversation forward after that.
Thank you so much, Nazee, and thank you all so much for coming. Let me just say 2 additional things by way of introduction. In addition to the fact it's wonderful to be with you, Nazee and Ali. When I was many years ago applying for grad school and I was thinking about a career in foreign affairs, I wrote a lot of people for advice. Many didn't respond, some did, and one person who did respond, I always remind her, was Robin Wright, even though she was already a legend at that time. And so for that reason, she'll always have a soft spot in my heart. And because today's conversation is about political culture in Iran, I also wanted to cite someone who meant a great deal to me, who just passed yesterday, a gentleman by the name of Karim Sadjadpour, who was the chief of staff to Empress Fahra Pahlavi for decades, and someone who really, I think, embodied the great wisdom and kindness and the best of Iranian political culture. So to the question about mistrust, one of the statistics which jumped out at me in the process of writing that essay was from the World Values Survey, which conducts surveys, I think, every half decade. And what that survey showed is that Iran is among the least trustful societies on earth. Only around 15% of Iranians believe that most people can be trusted. And this has been written about a lot over the years, about the correlation between high trust societies and democracy and low trust societies and authoritarianism. And so one of the experiences I saw over the last few years, just kind of observing from distance and at times up close, opponents of the regime, was that it was difficult for them to collaborate and form kind of a cohesive opposition against the government, because the country and the society is so burdened by this mistrust. And the mistrust, is there for good reason. There's an anecdote I remember from the former British ambassador in Tehran at the time of the revolution. You'll recall, Ali, Sir Anthony Parsons wrote a book called The Pride and the Fall, if I'm not mistaken. And he was recounting how towards the end of 1978, the Shah had summoned him, the British ambassador, to come see him at Niavaran Palace. And when he entered, the Shah asked him, the British ambassador said, "Why are you guys trying to get rid of me?" And Shah said, and Anthony Parsons said, "What are you talking about, Your Majesty?" And the Shah cited BBC Persian and things like that. And what Parsons reflected on is the fact that if you look at the Shah's lived history, well, outside powers helped bring his father to power. Outside powers helped depose the father and bring the Shah himself to power. And then outside powers had helped bring the Shah back to power in 1953. So there's a pattern there which people pick up. And so what I'll close by saying is that the mistrust is, I would argue, at least threefold. It's a mistrust that exists among Iranians writ large against the intentions of the outside world and the great powers. There's a profound mistrust within the regime, especially after the 12-day war, given how deeply the regime has been penetrated by foreign intelligence. I suspect Ayatollah Khamenei is just totally torn with mistrust about whom can he trust within the regime, who is working for the Mossad, who is it that he can trust. And then there's a profound societal mistrust against, obviously both the regime and I would argue even kind of parts of the intentions of what the opponents of the regime have in store for Iran.
Well said. Thank you, Karim. Robin, you've also, you were just telling me that you've been traveling to Iran since 1973. You have written extensively on culture and politics of Iran, and you have said in one of your articles that I read, Shiism is a culture of resistance, and in Iran, it's worth more to die in search for justice than to live under injustice. But you put that on the faith of Iranians, which is Shiism. Is Shiism the only, can you tell us how you came to that conclusion? And then I'm going to move to Ali to elaborate on the political culture of Iranians. How did you come to the conclusion that Shiism is part and parcel of the life of suffering for Iranians?
Look, it's the predominant religion in Iran, but I think that's not the only component. This is part of a culture. Iranians are ethnically a minority. They are, in the world, they are, or in the region particularly, they feel whether it's as a minority, they also, as they like to tell you often, they feel strategically lonely. And so I think you blend different elements together in terms of what the complex is. And the fact, as Karim has pointed out, as we all know in following Iranian history, the interventions by the outside world in shaping the country for millennia. I wanted to add to one of Karim's points too. One of the most important things to understand in political science is that the rule of thumb is that you need 30% of society to support you in order to survive if you're an autocratic regime. And that's to man the bureaucracy. That's to man the security forces. That's to pay, whether in taxes or in bribes, the money that the regime needs to pay its bills. So you have to ask yourself, when you're looking at this moment where we are, where is Iran in terms of the public support? And I think Nasser Hadian, who's a friend of many of us, told me a few months ago, it's 20% and probably less. Now, that may be true. The question is, does anyone else have the tools to kind of push the regime out, to initiate change, to create an alternative? And that's what we don't see. So this 20% support or less is pivotal in understanding, what happens next. And can I just add one little funny anecdote? So I remember in the probably 1986 about, and I was in Iran, and I was with someone from the Islamic Guidance Ministry for Irshad, and he was complaining about everything. It was the Iran-Iraq War, it was about the economy, it was about, he just couldn't stop complaining. And this is a guy who's a government employee. And then the rumor went around Tehran as we were eating lemon cake and drinking tea, that Ayatollah Khomeini had died. And his tone changed completely. And so this is the other element in defining Iranian society, that sense of nationalism. It's not just, I mean, it's Persian, but it's also, I think, Iran has an identity that dates back millennia. And so every time I hear someone talk about, you know, the death of the Ayatollah and whether that's going to spark change, or I always remember that conversation I had and how telling it was that a guy who worked for the government, loathed the government, but was absolutely devastated. And of course, it was a rumor, it wasn't true at the time. But this is, again, when we in the outside world live in our bubble of whether it's wishful thinking or our own political views, we have to be realistic. This is Iran, and Iran is so unique in its history, in its whatever the trust issues, its self-image. And, you know, the idea that one last thing, you know, I've written so many times, where there are 5 Iranians, there are 6 opinions, and maybe 7. And so there is a diversity, and trying to group them all together is, I think, you know, kind of folly.
Thank you, Robin, for that. Ali, you're a historian, and it just fits for me to ask you, can we dial this conversation back to a millennia or two and ask you about the cultural legacy of this society, the political culture of mistrust and pain and suffering? Is it only about Shiism, or are there other factors involved?
I mean, thank you very much, and it's great to be here and to be among so many friends. I think, you know, one of the things that we have to start with is really a question of definition about, you know, what we're talking about, and we can talk about Iran on one level, and we can talk about the political system on another. I mean, I tend to see the political system, as most Iranians tend to see it actually, as something that comes and goes. I mean, political systems never last forever. Dynasties come and go, and the way I see it, the Islamic Republic is yet another dynasty that, you know, may reach its a period where it becomes sclerotic, which I think it is. And you know, one of the striking things is that when they do get into that stage, they tend to appeal as far as possible to what they consider to be the deeper roots of Iranian national identity. And after the 12-Day War, by the way, I mean, I was very struck by the fact that they sort of appealed to all sorts of pre-Islamic monarchs on a grand scale. I mean, I have to say they dialed the dial went up to 11 on this point. And I did say to someone at the time, people said, oh, this is amazing, you know, look at all this nationalism at work. I'm a little bit more cynical about that. And, you know, what I was pointing out to them is 46 years of an Islamic revolution in which we have been fed a steady diet of Shiism, you know, albeit mixed occasionally with a bit of nationalism when they want to. After the 12-Day War with Israel, the only thing they could appeal to at the end of the day was Cyrus, Darius, and Shapur, and all these others, which to me reeked of ideological bankruptcy. I mean, if that's what you're appealing to, you're appealing to something which is outside the sort of revolutionary ideology of the regime. So there is a whole identity, a whole sort of national identity that states and regimes will try and appeal to. I think the Islamic Republic is probably the least qualified to actually try and appeal to a sort of a national agenda, but clearly that's what gains traction with many people in Iran, many young people in Iran, and it's been very striking, I think, in the last 5 years in particular, the absolute transformation that's taken place in public opinion and popular consciousness about what it means to be Iranian. And that, of course, appeals to narratives and myths, as you know, I like to call of the Shahnameh.
I'd love to hear the myth of Kaveh.
We'll talk about Kaveh.
Yes.
I mean, you know, people talk about the narratives of martyrdom that you get in Shiism. And to be honest, I think Karim and I in particular, and I'm sure yourself, you know, we get a little bit bored of learning how all Iranians are determined to be martyrs. There are other narratives that people buy on, and actually, if you look at the history of Iran and the rise of nationalism in Iran as a distinct ideology in the 20th century, they drew very, very heavily on narratives from the Shahnameh, which are what we would call the deeper Iranian narratives and myths. And one myth of emancipation,
Sorry,
as I call
Ali,
it.
can you just, for the sake of the audience that are not familiar with Shahnameh, could you just tell us what that is?
So the Shahnameh is what we ostensibly call the national epic. I know I'll get criticized by academic colleagues of mine for calling it a national epic, but it's basically an epic written in verse form, history of Iran from the creation to the fall to the Arab Muslim conquest in the 7th century. And it's sort of a mixture of basically myth, legend, with a smattering of history at the end. Probably more history than we think, but nonetheless, it's largely a mythology. And it's a very powerful mythology. And people will, up until the 20th century, the vast majority of people in Iran believed it to be history. This was the history of the country. And
the myth that you
and the myth that there are several myths, obviously. I mean, there are large tracts of the It's a huge text. Vast text, and there are more interesting bits as well as more tedious bits, of course. But one of the more powerful narratives, which were used very politically in the 20th century by a range of political factors, was the myth of Kaveh. And the myth of Kaveh is a narrative of emancipation that the Iranians adhere to. And it's a very powerful one, and it basically relies on this notion of, the rule of Iran by an Arab tyrant. The Arab tyrant, Zahak, the Dragon King, if you will, who obviously rules for a very, very long time. I won't tell you how long, but is ultimately overthrown in a rebellion led by the popular man. I mean, this is the interesting thing. A blacksmith by the name of Kaveh, who leads a rebellion after a while and says, enough is enough, we need to get rid of this tyranny. And as I always point out to people, myths, to my mind, always open a window onto the soul of a culture. And the thing about Kaveh is that I should say Zahak, he has these snakes coming out of his shoulders, and they need to be soothed, shall we say, by ointment. I forgive for those of you who just had lunch. Ointment made from the brains of youths. Okay, so you have to slaughter a few youths and smatter a bit of ointment there to make you feel better. And Kaveh rebels. This is the interesting little detail that most people forget. Kaveh rebels. There's the view that he has 18 sons, and he rebels when they come for son number 18. So he's quite happy, well, not happy, but certainly he puts up with it for 17 and then an 18. It's another way of describing Hemingway's famous sort of dictum that how did you go bankrupt? First very slowly and then very quickly. And this is basically actually sums up the political system in Iran, that you find that things go on for an interminable period and everyone gets very bored. We see this in the run-up to the constitutional revolution in 1906. We see this, in 1978, where things seem to be going fine, then very suddenly, very rapidly, things collapse. And this is what I always say to people when we look at the Islamic Republic. Don't get complacent, don't get bored, always be aware that things can change very, very quickly once the putative Kaveh gets up and says, enough. And I think a lot of us analysts and others look at this and look at the state of the economy in Iran. And I think, from my mind, the Islamic Republic will be undermined by its failure fundamentally to run a sound economy. A basic economy, let's not say a very successful economy, just an economy that can deliver electricity, gas, and water to its people. And if it can't deliver electricity, gas, and water to its people, sooner or later the people will say enough.
So actually, that's a good segue to the next question for Karim. Karim, on the timing and the person that will say enough to this regime. You have the 5 scenarios that you have put in front of us. One is Iran as Russia scenario, which you have told us that, in the case of a demise of the Islamic regime, there's a strongman like Putin who may come into power and radically change Iran. So could you tell us a little bit more about that scenario, Iran as Russia?
Sure. So let me set it up in like 30 seconds, and I'll talk about what are some of the non-parallels in that scenario, which is, essentially what we saw in Russia. And I always tell people that, when there's certain texts you read as a university student, which you remember, but they don't really speak to you until after you've been studying dictatorships for 2 decades, whether it's, George Orwell, and one for me, which really, I read a decade ago, was George Kennan's Long Telegram, his ex-paper, about the Soviet Union, which really jumped out at me, the kind of the parallels between the ideological nature of the Soviet Union and that of the Islamic Republic. So essentially you had a regime, the Soviet Union, that was incapable of doing what China did, which was to put their national interests and economic interests before revolutionary ideology. Eventually it imploded under the weight of its own economic malaise and ideological bankruptcy. That begot essentially a power vacuum for a couple of years, and there was, it created this great economic disparity between these emerging oligarchs and the rest of society, and it created fertile ground for the return of a strongman in the form of Vladimir Putin, who essentially threw out communism, replaced it with grievance-driven Russian nationalism, has now been ruling for 2 decades. Now, I can see the parallels between Iran and the Soviet Union. And you could see a scenario whereby the Islamic Republic ultimately implodes under the weight of its own internal economic malaise and ideological bankruptcy. That also begets a power vacuum. And like Russia, Iran is a very resource-rich country. And we already kind of know some of these resource oligarchs. And you could see a scenario whereby that power vacuum in Iran creates mayhem, tremendous wealth disparity, popular anger, and fertile ground for the return of another Iranian strongman. In this case, they would throw out Shiite nationalism as the nation's organizing principle and replace it with Iranian nationalism. Now, Iranian nationalism can take you in at least a couple different directions, right? You could use it like Putin has, a grievance-driven, angry nationalism in opposition to the West. Or it could be something along the lines of Sisi's Egypt, which is much more, it's less ideological, and it's allied with the United States, frankly similar to the Shah. Now, a couple distinctions I would make between Iran and Soviet Union and post-Soviet Russia. Number one, to get to that phase of collapse, the Soviet Union had Gorbachev. And we haven't yet had that in the Islamic Republic for precisely the reason that Khamenei is obsessed with the idea that the reason why the Soviet Union collapsed was because of Gorbachev. Right. And you should never abandon your principles if you're an authoritarian government, because that's not going to prolong your shelf life, it's going to hasten your demise. And we oftentimes, in our language, refer to Khamenei and his ilk as hardliners. They refer to themselves as principalists because they're loyal to the principles of the revolution. So that's one distinction between the Islamic Republic and the Soviet Union. The other distinction I would make broadly, and perhaps Robin and Ali can weigh in here, between Iran and Russia is that I think whoever rules Russia and Iran, whether it's an authoritarian government or a democratic government, I think those countries are always going to see themselves as great powers in competition with America. I don't think that's necessarily the case about Iran. In fact, historically, Iran has actually been allied with the West against predatory neighbors like Russia. So that's one distinction which, when we're kind of exploring what this means for the United States, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that Iran's political personality is always going to be in opposition to the US and West. In fact, that, I would argue, has been an historical anomaly of the Islamic Republic.
Got it. Thank you. I think, Robin, this is a good time for me to bring in your personal observations through your travels in Iran, because one of the essays I read in 2015, you were invited to go to the park and meet with people, and then on the way to the park, you passed by this art center, which was oriented towards the West. There was a Huckleberry Finn performance going on, and there was pictures of Frank Sinatra and Bob Dylan in the background. So I want to put that out there, and I want to say and read this from Karim's essay, that he says, in the Iran as Russia model, consumerism and conspicuous consumption will substitute Iranians' lost faith and collective purpose. So do you think Iran is already there? I mean, between the consumerism and conspicuous consumption, do you even see this compatible with now that we've kind of talked about what makes an Iranian and the identity and the nationalism. Do you actually think that will stick, the consumer's culture, or are we already there?
Consumerism, yeah. I mean, it's one of the defining, I mean, I'm always struck whether it's, you know, the merchants who will open their version of, and with the signs on the front of the store, Victoria's Secret or Black & Decker. And what they've done is they've imported, whether through on Dow's or, you know, paying a bribe at customs, and they have their own shops. And there is this sense of, their preference is much for Western ideas, Western goods, the identity more with the West. And that's always struck me. I mean, you go to the parkour court, you know, in up in the, or the Fire and Light park. I mean, this is the bridge that I think is one of the biggest in the world that goes across, you kind of pass from one mountain to the other, and there are cafes, and I went at midnight and there were kids on their bicycles and so forth. You know, the problem in the West is there's still these images of women in chadors, and, you know, we're going back now almost a half century. And I think Iran is one of the most lively countries in the region, maybe even the world. There is a sophisticated polity. You can talk to a guy on the street who's, you know, shining shoes, and he will talk to you with some knowledge about politics or you know, even American politics. I love going to Iran because it is such a dynamic place, dynamic society. I've forgotten your question, but yes, I mean,
this is great anyway. You know,
I mean, I think
are great.
this is where one of the important things to understand about this moment is we're now in the third generation since the revolution. And the first generation, you know, they turned out on the streets, many of them thinking that there would be more economic and political benefits, and got sucked into the Iran-Iraq war and, you know, felt, you know, kind of stuck with the system as it evolved and didn't deliver. The second generation still was sucked in by the social contract made between the government and its people to provide for them in exchange for support. What's really striking about the third generation is, yes, the girls were like unbelievable, leading the first time in history, whether it's a revolution or counter-revolution, led an uprising. They were badasses. And, you know, I'm always inspired. But the question, and they are not wedded to the social contract. And it is in ways because they want their kind of personal rights. They don't have a political alternative. They want their, you know, their ability to socialize. They don't want the restrictions of hijab. They want very much to have personal freedom. And that means, you know, political freedom, but it's the personal freedom that's the most important. So the question is, what is the social contract going to be that leads to, you know, an alternative? I think that we are in any transition that it's going to look pretty dark. Khamenei didn't have any support when he became supreme leader. It was kind of an accident. The system was changing the constitution so there'd be an executive president and the supreme leader would be kind of the titular power. And Khamenei built his own power base then by turning to the military. And you see more and more the role of whether it's the IRGC or the military in general, particularly after the 12-day war, thinking that they are going to provide this stability, security during the transition. And so I think the idea of finding, you know, some good guy or some good movement or some good female to come out and provide an alternative in any time soon is an illusion.
Thank you, Robin. It reminds me of Karim's famous saying that Iran is the country with most pro-American population and most anti-American leadership. So would I be correct if I said that your experience of meeting Iranians is that they want to be friends of the West, friends of America, and they're appropriating their ways because they have no other alternatives.
Can I just add very quickly to that? It's yes, there is that lust relationship, but it's more than Iranians want the West, the outside world, to recognize them. That's more important than to be to have that close relationship. They want and that was what the revolution was about. We want our independence. We don't want to be influenced by outsiders. And so I think this is where that any future relationship is going to be very much you come to us, and that's reflected in the current position on the nuclear program.
Right, thank you. Ali, of the 5 scenarios that Karim has put before us, Iran as Russia, maybe Iran as Pakistan, Iran as North Korea, they all feature a strong man or a strong military group. So we know, you know more than anybody else, that the social posts that we see on different platforms, people are out on the streets of Iran chanting for their own strongman, which was Reza Shah, the father of the late Shah, who was the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty. What exactly is wrong with having a strongman lead Iran?
Well, I mean, we could get into a long discussion about
authoritarianism
over democracy, or constitutionalism. I mean, I think authoritarian government is on the whole less efficient. But it is true, and I think you're absolutely right to say that there is a convergence in sort of political opinion and also public opinion towards the need or the desire for the man on horseback. And it's quite interesting. You see this from both left and right on the Iranian political spectrum. You see the rehabilitation of figures from the Reza Shah period that for 40 years have been largely ostracized. I think in particular a figure like Foroughi, who was enormously important in terms of the establishment of the modern Iranian state, but has largely been sort of dismissed by Islamists and the left in Iran as a sort of a radical nationalist of sorts. He's a much more interesting person than that, and I think they've rediscovered him, and they're now putting him forward as a sort of an emblematic of the real politique statesman, elder statesman for Iran. And of course, that occurs within the environment of a sort of a Reza Shah period. And of course, the right in Iran, I don't think there's any, it's not difficult to explain how the hardliners in Iran like autocracy, because they've been doing that for a while anyway. And then, of course, among the general public, there's a view that, yes, this sort of, they look back on a very, very profound sort of Pahlavi nostalgia, I have to say. But it sort of divides itself quite interestingly between the Reza Shah period and the Mohammad Reza Shah period. I mean, the Mohammad Reza Shah period gets more airtime because there's simply more film. I mean, there's a lot of film about him, and they like it, and there's a lot of interesting things. The Great Civilization doesn't seem so bad these days. It seemed like an opportunity lost.
And beautiful queens.
And yes, and also the films of people living their lives in a very ordinary manner and not worried about the veil. And of course, you see that. I mean, to go back to what Robin was saying, I mean, I think what's very interesting in Iran is, again, you distinguish between the society and the social change and the state. And I think your point was absolutely right. Society on the whole is much more liberal than the state, which is much more hardline and conservative with a small c, or even a capital C, if you wish. But it's interesting that sooner or later the politics will have to give way to the social pull. I mean, it's not going. I'm not convinced that whatever happens as we move forward will not have to respond in some way to what society is doing. And you see this with the women's veiling at the moment. So when you get regime officials getting up and saying, well, we haven't abolished the veiling laws, but we're not going to enforce them because we can't risk a riot. I mean, it's a good indication of where things are going. And when, they say now that 40% of women now in Iran are not just ignoring the veil, by the way, they're going full steam ahead, I have to tell you, with, wearing the latest sort of fashions. It's really quite striking. I mean, it's a testament to the stoicism, the perseverance, and the resilience of Iranians. I mean, that's something that I think people should be, and I think on that point, I agree with Robin wholeheartedly. I probably disagree a little bit with you on the nature of the state, I have to say. I don't think the state responds in quite the same way, and I think the state is very archaic in that sense. It's very sclerotic. So, there will be a sort of I know we all, when we say regime change, everyone goes apoplectic with, allergic with sort of fear and this sort of thing. Let's not use that word. Let's just keep it away. Let's not give ourselves a headache. What will happen internally. It will happen internally. The momentum will be internal. I think in the Western perspective, we shouldn't do anything to stop it happening. That's the basic, do no harm, as I say. But I think that sort of domestic pull, that change in the sense is coming. And if you want to use the term transition, maybe transition is a better term. And we see examples in Iranian history, of course, of this happening. And of course, the one that I've tried to outline to people is exactly the one that saw Reza Khan, later Reza Shah, emerge into the political limelight. And that was in the 1920s. And, we see that. It was a slow process, but it was by far, in many ways, the most revolutionary process the country witnessed. So I think these things, we need to avoid the need. I think we need to be careful in our short-termism now that we always like to see something dramatic and we want to see a rerun of the Islamic Revolution. It's not going to happen. Yeah, I mean, unlikely. It might do. I don't want to rule anything out. But my point is that if we keep trying to relive the past as if somehow it repeats itself identically, don't worry about that so much. I mean, what you need to look at is the longer trends. And I think here, as a historian, I would like to counsel people to take a more historical perspective and less of a political science perspective. But there's my bias speaking.
You're allowed your own bias.
Thank you.
I also want to side note that I don't want to get hate mail that I'm advocating for strongmen at all. That wasn't the point of this. That wasn't the point of this question. Yeah. But we have to address what's going on the streets of Iran. Karim, in your Iran-China comparison, you have said revolutionary purity remains the theory while economic growth will provide the thrust. Those are not your words, those are mine, but that's your theory. Can you expand on this?
Yes, so the idea of the China model is not unique to China, it's not unique to Iran. A lot of authoritarian regimes aspire to pursue the China model because it means basically they stay in power, right? And so my kind of crude description of the China model is as I was saying earlier, in the 1970s, the Soviet Union and China both reached this fork in the road. Mm-hmm. And that decision they had to make was, do we continue with revolutionary ideology or do we prioritize economic and national interests first? And the Chinese were able to do that. And with all their flaws and challenges, they lifted a great percentage of their population out of poverty. And the government has remained in power in contrast to the Soviet Union. So there have been advocates of the China model within the Iranian system for many years. I think most prominently it was the former president, Hashemi Rafsanjani, who had this idea that let's dilute revolutionary ideology and let's open up to the outside world and get wealthy. I think the modern versions of that in the Islamic Republic are the former president, Hassan Rouhani, and potentially the grandson of Ayatollah Khomeini, Hassan Khomeini. These are just two figures, but in the China model, an individual who was key to that was obviously Deng Xiaoping, and Deng Xiaoping was close to Chairman Mao, and he was a very experienced worldly person. And I'm a big believer in Kissinger's observation, which he said that before he went into government, he thought that when he was a professor at Harvard, he thought that the individual didn't really matter so much in history, that nation states follow their own interests regardless of who's in power. And after he served in government, he reached the opposite conclusion, that the individual profoundly shapes history. And that was his last book before he passed, was on leadership. And, I see kind of people within the Iranian system who aspire to be Deng Xiaoping's. I don't see anyone of that caliber. And then I'll go back to what I said earlier about Ayatollah Khamenei. Khamenei's view is that if you relax your principles, your revolutionary ideology, if you dilute those things, so the China model would require normalization with the United States. So it would require getting rid of death to America. And if you want to get rid of death to America and normalize with the US, it requires getting rid of death to Israel. Mm-hmm. So that would be a profound change in the Islamic Republic's political personality. And the fear of Iran's hardliners like Khamenei is that if we do that, it's like taking a sledgehammer to the pillars of a building. The entire thing is going to collapse on top of our head. And I happen to believe that Khamenei's instincts are correct, that I actually don't think that the Islamic Republic, even if they try to pull off the China model, I don't think they'll be able to, because as an economy, Iran is much closer to Russia than to China. It's much more a resource-driven economy. They don't have the labor engine that China did to kind of sustain several decades of economic growth.
Thank you for that. Ali, you wanted to say
I was just going to say, I mean, one of the problems, and I agree with Karim on this, I mean, Khamenei has basically doubled down, and we've got to a stage now where the economy is facing a real crisis. We've just seen, one of the banks collapse, and another bank is on the verge of declaring bankruptcy. I mean, it's the banking system in Iran, for those of you who are interested, is a vast Ponzi scheme, and it's basically unraveling. But the situation we're in now, they've had umpteen opportunities to try and restructure and reform the system. I remember, when Karim and I would go to, we're in Iran more regularly when Khatami was running around as the reformer. So he said very clearly, the economy in this country is structurally diseased. We need to change the structure of the economy. And I've written about this in terms of the nature of the economy. And I think there have been moments when change could have happened. I'll emphasize that. I'm not saying it would have, but could have happened. But now, Khamenei faces, and his acolytes face this situation where you reform or die, and reform and die. I mean, it's a sort of it's a classically Soviet dilemma for them. I mean, what do they do? And it's I don't envy their choice, but hell, I don't really sympathize with them either. It's the pit that they have found themselves in, and I think ultimately it will swallow them.
Thank you, Ali, for that. I feel like I have to fast forward with my questions for the interest of saving time. But so I'm going to condense my next few questions and put it to Robin. Karim has also made the comparison of Iran as North Korea model. And I think, Karim is known for having these wonderful comparisons and analogies. And one of the things he says is that people of Iran want to be South Korea, but people in the regime want to be North Korea. So with that in the background, Iran as China, Iran as Russia, and Iran as North Korea, none of that allows too much space for religion. I know we've talked about the role of faith and religion in the Iranian society, and I just want you to elaborate whether you foresee an evolution of Iran as any of these three models based on what you know.
So I've actually been to North Korea. And there's no
That makes it easy.
And there's just no comparison. Yeah. First of all, one thing that's really important in understanding Iran, whether it's China, North Korea, or whatever, that Iran 115, 120 years ago had the first constitution in all of Asia. It had the first elected parliament in all of Asia. And its constitution, even after the revolution, is based on Belgian and French law. It is Napoleonic. And the big debate, which, those who were opposed to the regime or were in other parties or whatever, when it came to writing the Constitution, they came up with, again, this Napoleonic Constitution. But the clerics wanted to have a parallel system so that there was, for every position or every institution, an Islamic equivalent. So you have the presidency elected, then you have the supreme leader. You have parliament, you have the Council of Guardians, you have the conventional military, you have the Revolutionary Guards, the justice system as well, whether it's civil or criminal. And so in the early days of the revolution, they put this constitution to the vote, and those who didn't want the Islamic half of the constitution boycotted. And so you had a system that is very Western in its laws, but at the same time had these checks and balances. And ever since the revolution, ever since that first constitution, the debate in Iran on every level, including its relationship with the outside world, is the Islamic Republic first and foremost Islamic or republic? And this is where the reform movement said it's a republic. This is where Rafsanjani's reforms and changing the power structure wanted to diminish the religious components or the religious powers and invest in elected officials. It is, which is supreme, God's law or man's law? And that is the debate and will be the debate even after Ayatollah Khamenei dies. It was after Khomeini died too. Can I just tell you a funny story? Because this is election day. So I remember in 1981 when Khomeini said, he reprimanded the divisions in Iran and said, he told quarreling politicians to stop biting one another like scorpions, which I love. But over the weekend, you saw Ali Larijani, who heads the Supreme National Security Council, describing the head of parliament as an opportunist. And it's just so striking to me that the kind of divisions they had, in the early days of the revolution still prevail in the scorpion biting. And the funniest part of this is that Khomeini said, and I'm quoting, "You saw recently the opposition between the two parties in the United States that wanted to choose a president. When one won and became president, the other party did not attack it and impose work stoppages." Anyway, he went on and talked about, you'll never see two parties in the United States working against US interests, he said. You think about where we are as a country, but also it just strikes me as this, that there is such this incredible debate in Iran, and even though the spectrum has gotten more and more and more narrow, it's, shedding those on those who were reformists or liberals or pragmatists or moderates or whatever label you gave them, and they're now down to the core. And even within that tiny core, there are huge divisions. So, I think this is, a fascinating time to watch Iran, but I also think, in some ways, it hasn't changed all that much.
I want to correct you on that. It's always a fascinating time to watch Iran.
True.
Always. So I have a last question, which I'm going to kind of mix with the foreign policy questions here that I have 4 of, and they're all great questions. Karim, I want to start with you. It's hard enough to predict the past, let alone the future. Tell us of all the 5 likely scenarios, Iran as Russia, China, Pakistan, Turkey, and North Korea. Which one is most likely to take place, and what would be the ramifications of that for the United States?
Well, I'll start with a note of humility, which is at the end of the essay, I had gone back and read foreign affairs essays from 1978 to see what was predicted when the Shah's government was collapsing. And at that time, one of the great scholars of Iran in the United States was someone called James Bill, who was teaching at William and Mary. And if you look at his predictions, he enumerated at least half a dozen of them. What he was emphatic in saying is that the clerics will never rule Iran and that Iran won't become anti-American. So exactly what happened, he predicted the opposite. So I start with that note of humility. I think to all of us from afar, and this is the challenge when we're talking about Iran, because it's a country which is inaccessible to most of us as researchers, journalists, and scholars. But certainly from afar, it appears that the most powerful institution is the Revolutionary Guards, the most powerful political and economic institution. So it wouldn't surprise me if someone who is an alum of the security forces of some kind eventually emerges. I would feel comfortable predicting that the next strong man, I would prefer to say gender neutral, but I don't think we're yet there.
It's not a bathroom, it's okay.
Is that I don't think the next strongman, if indeed there is a next strongman in Iran, is going to be wearing a turban. I think that the era of the clerics is over, and I'll stop there so we can have a little more time for Q&A.
Thank you.
Can I just add quickly to that?
Sure.
Remember that the big debate when Ahmadinejad was elected was the turban versus the hat.
Right.
And the hat was elected in part, people knew very little about Ahmadinejad, but they didn't want the clerics. And that was a total failure. And so that's why I think that there's this, if you go back to the issue of trust, where do you look? And that's why during a transition, the big thing, especially after the 12-day war, is going to be who makes the country feel secure.
That's right. Thank you. So Ali, being your student, I know about Akhundzadeh, who predicted that Iran owes a period of clerical rule for it to experiment with it and get over it. This is something you and I talked about at length. What do you think is a post-regime Iran looks like?
Well, I mean, I think the Islamic Republic has done a spectacularly good job of basically making sure that political Islam is dead in Iran going forward. I don't see Islam as a organizing principle in politics. I'm not one of those who thinks that Iranians are necessarily going to be irreligious. I mean, I think there will be a secular government going forward, but I mean secular in the Anglo-American sense of the term. So I don't mean that the people will necessarily become less spiritual in their own eyes, but they will
Separation of church and state.
They will certainly separate church and state. I don't think the clerics will have quite the role that they've had. I think any sensible government going forward would probably need to accommodate them in some way, of course, if you want to try and get a balance. But I think for the initial period, that will not be likely. I tend to feel that what you need to look at is less the IRGC, although the IRGC will certainly make an attempt to maintain the status quo and to try and protect as a sort of a, I think as a number of us have said, the Praetorian state, so to speak. But the IRGC, I think, have a little bit of a busted flush given their tremendous performance in the last 18 months, to say nothing of their ability to produce COVID detection machines and the other things, which I think people have sort of tended to view with a degree of contempt. I think where you probably do need to look at is a sort of a collection of individuals who may, from a wide range of backgrounds, including people who are within the system and out the system. But the person you will need to look at is the military side of that coalition. And what I mean is specifically Artish in terms of the army. Now, why do I say that? Not because necessarily they will be distinct and different in terms of, certainly their political leanings. I mean, we know, for instance, any of us and the few of us I see in the audience here who look at the security and military apparatus in Iran know that between the military and the IRGC, there's a little bit of, how should we say, fudging. But the problem is how you present that to a public. I mean, how you present it to a public. And if you bring an IRGC person forward as a sort of person who's going to save Iran, I think everyone would laugh. I mean, they wouldn't take it seriously. But if you look at it in terms of someone who, covers himself in the flag, and by the way, the flag I would talk about is with the lion and sun, that would help. That will be something that I think will garner a certain amount of appeal among the Iranian population and certainly among the young. So it's that, to my mind, moving forward. I think the models that Karim has put out are excellent in terms of giving us something to reference.
To experiment.
But of course, as we know, and what will happen in Iran will be something different. That's just the natural thing. But this is just to help us think about ways in which we want to look at it. And I think Robin is absolutely right, of course, that Iran has a long tradition of political change and reform. And one has to hope, and this is our optimistic note, that the strong man is especially enlightened and has a vision for the future. I think the worst case scenario is a Putin-like scenario, where they just use nationalism for the sake of nationalism and go around beating up everyone. But a nationalism on the way that Fouroughi discussed, I think would be a much more interesting setup for all of us. And for the first time, I would say, in certainly my working career, I think now that we're looking at a post-Islamic Republic, I feel actually genuinely that there is an element of optimism that we may possibly think about the way things would develop. But I will caution that, as Karim says, we all need to be very careful about predictions. As a historian, I would like to avoid predicting anything. I think we can prophesy, as one historian said, which means that I can make sweeping generalizations, but I wouldn't want to be very particular, and I wouldn't want to put a timeline on it. I think it will be a process, and I think we need to accept it as a process and to be able to engage with it when it happens.
So just a note of clarification that by the flag of lion and sun, you don't mean a monarchical flag, the flag of
Not necessarily, no, not necessarily. I mean, the monarchical flag would have the crown on top of the lion and sun. I mean, the lion and sun, I think, symbols matter. And people are very scathing. I wrote a piece on my Substack recently where I talked about the lion and sun. I got the characteristic abuse from a number of Islamists, and saying this is all a fake thing and so on. Well, I have to say, the lion and sun, if it's as old as the 12th century, as most scholars would accept that it's earlier or something like that. Well, the English three lions is about from the 13th century, so it's not bad going. I mean, my view is that these are symbols that attract the popular, they emote, and I think we need to think about these things. This is what nationalism, this is what these sort of ideas are about, and I think it has appeal, and that's why almost every opposition group, by the way, uses the lion and sun. I mean, but Iranians need to reclaim that symbol for themselves.
Thank you, Ali. Robin, same question to you. Which of the 5 scenarios do you see most likely as an outcome? And if you want to add anything on your own, I'd be interested to know your views on the women's movement, the women life freedom movement. I've always thought that the next revolution in Iran is on the backs of its women.
Yeah, I tend to agree, actually.
Yep, and you've kind of said it at the very beginning. None of the 5 scenarios include a woman in it. Iran has Russia, China, Pakistan, North Korea, or Turkey, but what are your views on that?
So I wouldn't pick any of the 5. I think Iran is its own polity. It will chart its own course. I think, when we look at the future, we also have to consider our tensions with Iran and other parties, including Israel and the United States, over. And so there are a lot of different elements, factors, that could intersect and shape, what happens next, the thinking of the people. I think when Karim thoughtfully found these 5 alternatives, what in terms of contemporary times might provide a model, I don't think any of them. And again, I just think, this is such a vibrant place that it will muddle, and I mean really muddle. One of the things we haven't talked about, no one's mentioned, is, will they have a supreme leader? Who are the candidates? And, this is where, whether it's looking at the opposition and where is the leadership, or who within the system will try to claim some of the positions that will still be out there. So I always love reading everything Karim writes, and he has a book that's coming out next year that I can't wait to read. But this is where, it's one of the reasons I love this place, is because it's just Iran.
Yeah. No, I told you in the back that when I read your essays, your affinity for Iranian people comes through like no one else that I have ever read. And I appreciate that, and I thank you for it. Thank you for being a friend to the Iranian people. That goes for all of you. I feel like we have 5 minutes, am I right? 1 minute. I don't know what we can get done in a minute because this is a JCPOA question. I'm sorry, I have to stick to the questions that were before me online. Who can give us a strategy towards a nuclear Iran by the Trump administration? Karim? In 1 minute.
Yeah. So I think historically, if we look over the course of the last 2 decades, there's a pretty clear formula that emerges. What has worked when negotiating with Iran? And in my view, it's a combination of pretty significant economic pressure, and that's not just unilateral American pressure, but global economic pressure, coupled with a credible military threat, And number three, in pursuit of what I would call a viable, clear outcome, limited outcome. It's not asking for Iran's total capitulation. And I think that elements of that formula right now exist. There's obviously a credible military threat. Iran doesn't control its own skies. Iran is under severe economic strain, but is still exporting almost 2 million barrels per day. So that number needs to be curtailed. It's Iraq exports to China. And number three, there does need to be kind of a clear vision for what the end game is from the Trump administration. If you're just asking for Iran's total capitulation, abandoning its nuclear program, I'm skeptical that they will do that. But this is a regime which has shown that it usually can only make these types of major compromises when it feels existential angst, and I think it's in that zone right now of existential angst.
Perfect. 1 minute is up. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for our viewers online, everywhere else, and hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Thank you.